As you might recall, we have broken DeWitt's chapter 30 into two parts, the first part of which concerns evolution's alleged implications for religion, the second part of which will concern evolution's alleged implications for ethics. This is the second mini lecture on the first part. So, in our last lecture, we discussed some unclarities that I think pervade DeWitt's account. He suggests, I think somewhat misleadingly, that evolution shows that humans aren't special. What it does do, I think, and I approach this historically, is make it more difficult to show or to assume the specialness of humans. So I'm not going to go over that material again. There's a different problem between evolution and traditional religion, which DeWitt suggests, which I also think is a little bit misleading. Namely, that he just keeps harping on the naturalness of natural selection. And he acts as if that excludes the supernatural as such. This, like everything raised in chapter 30, is admittedly a complicated issue, but I think DeWitt's argument is too compressed and is somewhat problematic here. It is not clear that divine involvement in a natural process would undercut its naturalness. Now, I'm not saying any such thing has happened. I'm not even saying it could. What I'm saying is, if it did, it wouldn't automatically undermine the naturalness of the process. There's a rich philosophical literature about the idea of miracles, whether they can happen, whether it can be rational to believe in them. Much too much material for us to go into here. But the traditional understanding of a miracle would be a violation of a law of nature while that law of nature remains a law of nature. That's crucial. And surely DeWitt knows this, but he kind of writes as if he doesn't. He writes as if any kind of supernatural involvement would bring supernatural cooties into the natural order. But again, the classic understanding is if something worth calling God were to part the Red Sea, let's assume Newtonian physics for now, that wouldn't undermine Newtonian physics. It would constitute a supernatural exception to what remains the natural order. So if God had some role in initiating evolution by natural selection, or even intervened in it in some way, that would not automatically undermine the naturalness of natural selection. A related but somewhat distinct point is that I think DeWitt makes a serious mistake when he equates the empirical with the natural. Here's an example in which we would have impressive empirical evidence for something supernatural. If tonight, as soon as the sun goes down, the stars were to rearrange themselves and spell out in English, "Yo, I exist, your pal God," and then spell it out in French and Spanish and Urdu and every language as the stars made it across the globe, that would be empirical evidence for a supernatural conclusion. You can decide how strong the evidence is, but it's pretty significant. It would get our attention. So it's certainly possible that we could have empirical evidence that a miracle has occurred. I am not saying we do have such evidence or anybody ever has had such evidence. That's a separate question. We are not committing philosophy of religion here. My point is that DeWitt's discussion, in which he says you've got to keep natural selection natural, is just not very clear and not particularly compellingly motivated. So I think DeWitt is excessively hard on traditional religion and evolution's alleged implications for traditional religion, which I find strange because there are 99 problems that are much more direct that evolution does present for traditional religion, and DeWitt doesn't discuss those. It seems to me the worry is once you sign on to evolution by natural selection, the kind of designer, the kind of all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good, that's what traditional O3, omnipotent, omnibenevolent, and omniscient. A deity like that uses evolution to account for or bring about its purposes is using a terribly painful, inefficient process. Think about any sort of mildly desirable feature that we have, like eyelashes, if those were acquired over the course of generations, surely not by quasi-human ancestors, they're older than that, but by some kind of creature that can feel pain, think of the amount of sand in eyes that accumulated over time in order to give us this very significant, though in the grand scheme of things, minor advantage. Think of all the suffering that is involved in the painful acquisition of characteristics that allow one to be relatively adapted to a relatively constant environment. If there were something like the traditional all-knowing, all-good, all-powerful God who had it within his or her power to grant adaptive characteristics to creatures, surely that would involve tons less suffering than using evolution by natural selection to bring about that process. And so if, as most scientifically well-informed people are, you're convinced that evolution by natural selection has been basically established, then there are significant and direct challenges to traditional theism. I just don't understand why DeWitt would use such kind of roundabout and unclear ways of getting there. So the most direct challenge is a version of what in the philosophy of religion is called the problem of evil. Take any bit of suffering, say a deer trapped in the wildfires that ravaged Colorado. Does God know about it? As traditionally conceived, the answer seems to be yes. Should God care about it? Well, if God's all good, it doesn't seem clear that God could be utterly indifferent to the horrible suffering of sentient creatures. Could God do something about it without breaking a sweat? Initially, it seems so. So that's a challenge to traditional theism. Evolution by natural selection is a scientific variation on this traditional problem. But of course, this problem goes way, way back to St. Augustine, if not earlier than that. We spend lots of time on it when I or anybody teaches philosophy of religion. There's a ton to be said about it. It's not our job here. So, summing up at least the implications of evolution for traditional theism, there are big problems between evolution and traditional theism. But I do find that DeWitt tends in this direction a little bit. There's a certain tendency towards smug atheism from the Richard Dawkinses and Sam Harrises and people like that of the world. Those are public intellectuals. If you don't know who they are, don't worry about it. That I think underestimate the intellectual resources of traditional theism and do so at their peril. So if you're a theist, you need to do some work to try to reconcile your religious beliefs with the apparent truth of evolution by natural selection. But I don't know that you need to address the problems that DeWitt raises because they're not very clearly or compellingly formulated, or so it seems to me. Briefly revisiting that issue, experience can't tell you that something like divine intervention doesn't or can't happen, because we don't have that scope of experience. At most, we could tell by experience that such things don't happen very often, that they're exceedingly rare, which leaves intact a natural order. It does not establish the exclusion of some supernatural story behind or before this natural order. And I confess I'm just kind of mystified as to why DeWitt chooses that roundabout and unclear way of presenting the challenges rather than the more direct one via the problem of evil. He does discuss process theology as an alternative that tries to compromise between something like evolution by natural selection and traditional theism. Process theology is an application of process philosophy. We briefly talked earlier in the semester about how we tend to have a physics, a metaphysics, an ontology that is nouny, that starts from objects and then has things happen to objects. Process philosophy tends to be verbier. It thinks of objects as just sufficiently slowly unfolding processes. So, flash of lightning, we encounter that as an object, a noun. Arguably, it's more of an event, more of a happening. What does any of this have to do with God? Well, as process theologians see God, God is not a particularly important piece of furniture in the universe. They don't like that picture where you populate your universe with stuff. Their universe consists of things developing, unfolding, happening. So, God within process theology is conceived of as a growing and learning aspect of the universe, interacting with its creation. So, in DeWitt's backyard pool analogy, rather than God just having a plan that is then flawlessly executed or watching us screw up within the confines of this plan that God flawlessly executed, God grows, or maybe God is the name we give to growth. And DeWitt argues that you get a deity that is more involved with its creation, that learns, grows, changes, and so it's a less boring universe, as it were, for God as well as for God's creation. I happen to be a gigantic jazz nerd, and so this idea that there's a kind of cooperative improvisation unfolding in the universe is, to me personally, in some ways a kind of attractive idea, though my religious views or lack thereof are none of your damn business, and yours are none of mine. So at this point, what I hope you're able to do is look back over the DeWitt and understand what he sees as the tensions between evolution and traditional theism, the process theological alternative, but also my worries about the challenges DeWitt sets up. I don't really have much to say in criticism of DeWitt's presentation of process theology. That's not a particularly popular view. Some people think it's the best of both worlds. Some people think it combines the weaknesses of evolution by natural selection, excuse me, with the weaknesses of traditional theism. You will hopefully think about this on your own time, maybe discuss it with people close to you. And it's worthwhile trying to have a value orientation in this world that is scientifically well informed. That is a challenge. It's not something we can do within Philosophy 120, but hopefully it's something that Philosophy 120 can help you do on your own. Thanks as always for your time and attention.